Hello and welcome to Cultural Complexities, living with and finding a family within the Latin and Asian American Pacific Island culture. We are very excited to be here with you all today and share our stories with you. We partnered with the Intuit Latinos Network and the Asian Pacific Network to bring you into the conversation of navigating and bringing our whole selves to work, whole selves within our cultures and finding our family within the people we surround ourselves with. My name is Ladarian Diaz. My pronouns are they, she. I am non-binary trans. I am Afro-Latine, as well as disabled. Among other things. And joining me today, I have Lucy Shen, Monica Miyasato, and Abigail Barcelos, and they're going to be talking about their resource groups. Lucy?
All right. Hello, nice to meet you all. My name is Lucy. I use any pronouns. I am one of the Bay Area Pride co-chairs. And usually when it comes to labels, I just say queer. But when pressed for the specific labels, it's agender, asexual, panromantic. I think you can see why I try to avoid the alphabet soup. My first language is technically Shanghainese, which is interesting because I can't speak it anymore. But I do still speak English and Mandarin Chinese. So.
Awesome, thanks. Hi everyone, my name is Monica Miyasato, and my pronouns are she, her. I was born and raised in Lima, Peru, and I moved to the US, California specifically, when I was 19 years old. My first language is Spanish, but obviously I speak English. And I'm also half Japanese on my dad's side, half Peruvian Spanish on my mom's side. Here at Intuit, I'm a staff program manager, and I'm also a global leader for our Intuit Latinos network, and an ally for the Pride Network as well.
Love that. Hey everyone, my name is Abigail. My pronouns are she, they. I am the global Pride advisor as well as an events project manager here at Intuit. I am a first-generation Filipinx American. I was born in LA, Los Angeles. I am non-binary and lesbian. English is my primary language, but I also speak conversational Tagalog and Spanish. And I'm here representing, I'm part of many ERGs here at Intuit, but I'm representing specifically the Asia Pacific Network.
Awesome, and thank you all for joining me today. Before we start with our first questions, let's take a moment to explain intersectionality. Intersectionality is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a person or group, and how those categories overlap and create systems of discrimination and disadvantage. That said, we'll start off with the question for our three panelists here. How does your intersecting identities affect how you present yourself to your family members? And I'll start with you, Lucy.
It's, I think, definitely complicated. It all started, I guess I'll start from the story of coming out, or trying to being the key part here. It really is, when I first came out to my parents, it was, I think I tried to do it lightheartedly over the dinner table, and perhaps unfortunately they responded similarly lightheartedly by laughing the whole thing off, and then sweeping it under the rug and pretending it never happened, which was uncomfortable in lots of ways, but that was the first and only attempt I made to come out as panromantic, actually. That conversation has changed a little bit over the years, but the biggest, most important part of that conversation is that we haven't revisited it since then. And I think a huge part of that is, yesterday we were talking, and I brought up a webcomic that I saw on Twitter by an artist named Richard Mercado about coming out to their parents as gay, I believe. And it was a lot about you taught me how to pronounce this word, utang na loob. Am I saying that right? Okay. About gratitude and debt to family figures who you literally owe your life to, right? And so I think the webcomic resonated with me a lot because I shared those feelings of like I owed it to my parents to not bring it back up at the dinner table again, because it clearly made them uncomfortable. And also that in our culture, in Chinese families, and I'm sure in many other cultural contexts, that a lot of the communication of familial love happens in a not verbally explicit way. And so if my mom was going to apologize to me for something, she would bring me cut fruit, right? She wouldn't necessarily be like, I love you, or I'm sorry. She would just like show up with tea and fruit. And I'd be like, okay, all is forgiven. I understand. And similarly, I think that conversation in my family has been that I've noticed little things where my parents have started to signal that they are accepting my identity in certain ways. Without explicitly addressing the fact that we ever had this conversation or that I ever brought it up at the dinner table. And so it's a tricky space to navigate, but I think I have hope that they'll come around. And so much of it, how I've undergone this conversation has to do with like how our very Chinese family operates and communicates with each other.
Thank you. And Monica.
So my perspective, as a cis Latina and born and raised in Latin America, we have, and also being half Asian, we have very traditional, cultures. And, in Peru, Latin America, most countries in Latin America are primarily very widely Catholic as well. So, whenever I try to come to my family or those close to me in that, culture arena, about, women's issues or, LGBTQ plus community issues, sometimes I'm like laughed off, it's like, oh my gosh, the rolling of the eyes, you're a feminazi, those types of things. So, I just really try to come in with, like, okay, this is why I think the way I think, I try to listen to what others, points of views are. Like, I know I'm not always right. And those things sometimes, I'm like, oh, okay, you're coming from this place, but let me tell you where I come from, right? And then maybe we can meet in the middle. And I think it's like slowly, kind of getting better as time goes on. And the culture itself is shifting a little to being a little more open, more understanding, and things. So that's kind of been my experience.
Thank you so much.
For me, there were two pivotal points in my life. The first was when I was 22 years old. I came out as a lesbian to my friends and my mom's side of the family. And thankfully, they were mostly accepting. They were just mainly confused because for several years of my life, I was in a relationship with my high school love, who was a boy, and all throughout college. So for them, it was just kind of like, whoa, like all of a sudden you're a lesbian? What does that really mean? And the second wasn't so much a coming out, but more of a personal realization for me that I'm non-binary. And growing up, I've always been a tomboy or masculine of center. And within the last couple of years, navigating my own evolving identity, I wasn't sure if I was allowed to take up space. I've been super overly cognizant of queer baiting. We hear that a lot, like in social media. And even within my own queer community, I really wanted to make sure that I took the time to really process what being non-binary meant to me. And there was no announcement that I made. Everything just clicked when I learned that I can take up space and just building up my own confidence to know that I can say that I'm non-binary. My pronouns are she, they, and just knowing and trusting that my friends, my family, everybody that's followed me along this journey, were gonna be here to support me, and they would love me regardless. And from a cultural context, in the Filipino culture, Catholicism is super huge, part of our identity. And I've spent over the last decade of my life studying our history. And the more that I learned about our indigenous culture, the more that I learned that I really resonated with who we were as a people pre-colonization. And there is this Visayan term called babaylan. And babaylan were known as spiritual shaman. They're primarily women or trans women who also allowed gay men within the community. And they were known as healers that were tapped into our past, our present, and our future. And that third gender is pretty common not only in Philippine culture, but also in Native American, as well as many other Southeast Asian communities and South Asian. So with that cultural context in mind, I grew up Catholic, but I learned that I became far more spiritual. I mean, still pray, but it just means something different to me now.
And I think it's, you mentioned how you felt like you were taking up space, and oftentimes people refer to different things as like your slice of the pie, but it's never about taking away from somebody else. You being, you know, non-binary, or you being part of this community doesn't mean somebody else goes hungry. It's, you know, you get to claim who you are, and I think that's important, because I've, like you, I came out multiple times. I came out as non-binary. Now I'm more, you know, trans femme, and, you know, adding the pronouns to my pronouns. It took a lot of fear, getting over fears, and, you know, the help of my spouse to do that. So I resonate with that feeling of that coming out and kind of coming out again and so forth. Now, Lucy and Abigail, you've also brought up some good points about coming out. And since coming out, how has that decision affected you in your interactions with your family?
So I mentioned that my first coming out didn't go so great. Perhaps in the long run, and I don't know if I'm just imagining the whole like little signals that they're dropping me here and there, but it truly did not go the way I hoped that it would. And so given the alphabet soup that I dropped earlier, and the only one that I came out to them as was panromantic, or tried to, I haven't even addressed the entire gender side of this equation at all. And part of it is because it wasn't necessary. Similar to Abs, I like had a long-term partner. I was like for 7 years with a cis man, and so there was no reason basically for me to even bring this up. Like, we thought we were gonna get married, and then of course, I mean, now it's different. Now that I'm single again, maybe it's time to address the conversation. But there was just, because the first one went so poorly, it just didn't seem worth it for me to bring up any other kind of coming out with my parents, or even try to have this conversation about gender with them. And I used to think it didn't matter, because the way that I showed up in front of them was the same as the way I showed up in front of anyone else. I wasn't like splitting my identity in front of them. I wasn't behaving differently. I wasn't presenting differently. I dress, talk, act the exact same way. But what I slowly come to realize, even as we were talking about this panel and like answering questions and discussing it together, that the reality of that is that actually, because I have not broached the subject with them, and they probably don't understand it, that there's a fundamental component of my identity that they don't understand, that they might never understand. But if I never give them the chance to understand it, then they never will, right? And so even though I don't act differently in front of them, the way they perceive me is different. And it does matter, actually, that they perceive me in a certain way. That it's not about the way I present, but the way they see me. And if they do not understand me in my entire complexity as a human being, that there is like a fundamental part of me that they will never see. And I would like for my family to be able to accept me wholly as who I am. And so I think almost like the tragedy, or the grappling with that complicated feeling of like, should I talk to them about it? Should I not? What are the risks? What are the trade-offs? That's been slowly creeping into my conversations with them. And I am curious to see how it'll pan out, especially not just with my nuclear family, but my extended family. Haven't come out in any way to them. Conversations I've had with lots of trans friends about like, should I wait till grandma passes? Like, I only have one grandparent left. Is it worth stressing them out? Or would I rather talk to them about, would I rather grandma understood who I was before she moved on? And I'm sure, you know, to her it also is hopefully something that she would value. These complicated feelings plague my thoughts now, but I'm glad we started the conversation here.
And one thing I want to call out is, and I appreciate you sharing that, I think it's important to know that everybody's journey of coming out is different. You know, for me, I don't have the relationship with my family, so my identity is very important to me. Whereas, you know, some people have familial ties that are important, and you're trying to navigate your mental health and those relationships with who you are. And that's a struggle in itself. So I think it's important to call out that there's no wrong way to do it. It's just about how you get to being as much of yourself and as true to yourself as you can be. So I appreciate you sharing that, because that can't be easy, you know, and it is a journey in itself. So Abs, you want to share?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, I grew up Catholic and in a pretty conservative household. And in high school, I was also pretty involved with the church. I taught catechism and confirmation, so that transition from me coming out and also reckoning with what that meant for me, like high school life and growing older. I think for my mom's side, most of their concern was really about my safety. They had a fear of me potentially being held back in school, held back in my career, me being judged, or you know, worst case scenario, being a target of violence. And for my friends, they were constantly questioning, are you really a lesbian? Are you sure that you may not just be experimenting, or maybe you're bisexual, or why don't you date me and I can prove you wrong. And I wish that I had the words at the time, but what I really needed to hear from them was that they just trusted me and my journey to figure out what would be the best for me as I'm trying to figure it out. And thankfully, 15 years later, as we've all grown and evolved, they've seen me, and they have also grown and evolved in how they can learn how to support me better, so I'm super grateful for that. And I think probably the most challenging for me was coming out to my dad's side, and that happened in my mid-30s, so a few years ago. I had a lot of anxiety about coming out, especially to my paternal grandmother. She's the matriarch of our family, and I have a gay uncle who came of age at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s. And also tossing in there that he's Gen X and he immigrated here. So there's that context, that utang na loob, that my whole family came here. The least I can do is stay quiet and not make waves. Whereas for me, I'm a millennial and I'm first gen. I was born here. I have the audacity to talk back. I have the audacity to take up space. So while he was dealing with our family questioning him, I was in the background actually learning through him how to be an advocate, because I was that person that wrote my grandparents a letter and was like, you should love my uncle, he's your son, and I would post it on the fridge and call everybody out. And that, thankfully, when my grandma and I have these tough conversations, she remembers that. So when she hears me going to bat, not only for my uncle, for myself, but for the entire community, it's a trigger for her of, I am capable of changing my mind when presented with new information, which is me, who will relentlessly advocate for people that I love, including our trans plus community.
And honestly, that tracks for you just from knowing you. I love how strong you are and how you always go to bat for people. So knowing that story, I feel your uncle is very lucky to have you. And just talking about your stories, talking about waiting for, unfortunately for grandma, not sure if you're waiting for her to pass or not. I came out to my stepmother and my uncles only last month. And I regret the fact that I waited until after my stepfather had passed to do that. He was very conservative in a lot of the things he would say, but I never gave him, I made the decision for him. I never gave him the chance to know if he would accept me. And I wasn't sure if my stepmother would. She did. My sisters did. Now, the other side of my family is not so much, but that was a big step. So again, not easy, but the fact that, advocating for yourself, learning from your uncles and things like that to advocate for yourself is amazing. And I'm just grateful to have you as your truest selves today. Now, Monica, when it comes to the Latin culture and how we intersect and interact with the queer and trans people, what impacts are you seeing?
Yeah, so again, being born and raised in Latin America and coming here, when I was 19, it's a little further in life. Growing up, I saw it really normalized around me culturally. Group of my cis men friends would jokingly say very derogatory names, call each other derogatory names towards the LGBTQ plus community. And when you're growing up in that sort of environment, you kind of think it's okay when it actually isn't. You're hurting people by doing that, right? And coming to California specifically, a lot more, when I was 19, a lot more open. There's a lot more exposure that I got here. Back home, I barely even interacted with the LGBTQ plus community. So coming here, learning about stories, experiences, the humanity behind it all, and how our words have an impact, really opened my eyes to become more of an ally and to kind of shift the chip a little, right? So also when you grow up, you also get exposed to more. But I had a friend back home who, I knew him from, since middle school, and he never came out, but he thought that he couldn't. And when he graduated college, he had to move to Paris to come out because he felt that, being in Latin America and seeing how others were treated, he didn't want to be a part of it. He wasn't comfortable enough. So like, if you have to leave your home to be able to be your whole self, like there's a problem, right? So I think things are moving, a little slowly, but they are moving forward. I see every time I go back, whenever I talk to my friends, my family, there's, again, more exposure, more openness, and listening to others' experiences and feelings. So I think it's going in the right direction. But a little on that Latin culture also, as part of the global ERG for the Intuit Latinos Network. Again, we keep saying Intuit Latinos Network. That's officially our name. But we realized that that might not be inclusive. And Spanish itself as a language is very non-gender neutral. So it's masculine, feminine. If you're masculine, then it ends in O, whatever word. And if it's feminine, it ends in A. And that's just kind of like the root of the language. So as an ERG, as an employee resource group, we are starting those conversations to see how, around identity within our communities. So we're actually starting a series called Cafecito en Chisme. We actually, at the end of the month, we're starting our first one. And we're, again, starting at the basics, right? Kind of like what we did here with the I think it was 201 this time, about like where's the origin of these different terms, like Latina, Latinx, Latin, Latina. There's so many of these, like where do these come from? Why did they come about? So that we can all make an educated decision about our identities, about how we want to identify ourselves as a community. How can we be inclusive of others without losing, our identity as well? So that's something we're starting. Hopefully, that will bring about, like, if anything, how can we be more inclusive as a ERG, as a community? We might not change our name, but we are at least opening a safe environment for everyone to share their opinions and get educated around that. So.
And I think what's special about that is like you said, is it's within the Latin community, Latinos, Latinas, and it's bringing everybody to the table within that intersectionality, if you will, or in that culture, to have that conversation of inclusion. Because like you said, we may not land where, say, I might think we should land, or where somebody else might think we should land, but if we can land somewhere where we all feel included and feel like our voices are heard, I think that's an amazing step. And yeah, that's not the, what's the word? It's not going to be the pillar for all of society, but even if we can start with Intuit, right, then everybody at Intuit can feel included in that group, and we maintain and grow our members.
Absolutely.
So I think that's wonderful. Our kind of to that nature, our culture can really affect how we present ourselves with our family and at our workplace. And for some of us, if the work culture welcomes these intersections, our workplace might be the only place for some of us where we can feel open and out, where we might not be able to do so with our families just yet. So Intuit holds the value of bring your whole self to work every day. Without that value, the many hundreds of us watching, or talking in the summit, wouldn't be sitting here today. And so with Intuit's culture of acceptance, I'm going to kind of transition here to talk a little bit about safe spaces and how we create those safe spaces and how we're able to thrive, within our groups. And I'm going to express my personal example is, because I don't have the relationship with many members of my family, and I'm at work most of my life, I've created a family at Intuit. And there are specific people in that family who, honestly, I really look back on and think I get to be who I am today because of them. And one of those people who, couldn't be here today, but is actually one of the chairs in the Intuit Latinos Network, which is Dre Rodriguez Miller. And, I've known her since I've started at Intuit. And when I had my children, she was one of the first people to, congratulate us, and she's never missed a birthday. When she had her child and when she was married, we were, parties to that. We, she's very close to us. And when I came out, she was one of the first people to, come to me and one, congratulate me on the start of that journey, and then two, to sit down and go, hey, I don't understand everything. Help me so that I can be that person to you. And that didn't just end with her. That continued to her husband. That continued to her child. And Matt Miller, who is also an Intuit employee, it continued to him. And he recognizes my pronouns, and he reaches out to me to see how I'm doing and making sure that I'm being treated well. So, that all being said, that's where I jump into this next section here, is when you look back on what you've experienced, did you have someone there in your life, where you felt safe enough to be open about who you are? And when thinking about having a safe space for people around you, what's one thing that you'd recommend our allies and community do to extend that welcome and say, come on in, take the burden off, and be 100% true with me? Lucy.
I've been lucky to always been blessed with really accepting friend groups and social groups. I was a theater kid in high school. I did wushu, which is a performative Chinese martial art, in college. I am a very active cosplayer, a member of the Northern California cosplay community. These are all spaces where I consider them like fundamentally weird in some way, right? Like I think, and we all kind of, it's all about performance and like putting on an act, or like being very mindful of how you're being perceived in whatever role or position it is that you're playing. I think because I've always frequented spaces like this, that I've always been in, this fundamental weirdness makes it so that we welcome people of all walks of life all the time, from all over. And because I've had these wonderful communities role model to me, and slowly starting to like learn what it is about, like what is it that makes a safe space, a welcoming space. I think for me, it comes down to volunteering vulnerability. To start with, like, being very open about my anxieties and the things that I really don't like, or the things that bother me, and opening up this space of like, now that I'm being vulnerable and I'm showing it to you, I'm hoping that you'll reciprocate and meet me where I am, and we'll find each other in a comfortable space in the middle that matches both of our needs in the moment. And I think that codifying this vulnerability as the cultural norm of any particular community is, to me, the secret sauce of creating a space for a group of people that is comforting and safe and warm and inviting. So
I love that. And also, wushu is so cool.
I love wushu.
Monica?
Yeah, so I mean, as an ally, I try to always come in with like an open mind and an open heart to whatever, new situation I'm being presented with, or new individual that I'm being presented with. And I honestly believe that, everything, like hatred and bigotry and everything in between comes from a place of ignorance. I mean, how can you, it's like either you haven't been exposed to it, or you just like mentally are blocking this information. So I think that's why this sort of forums are so important, and I'm so grateful that, I've been able to attend the last two Trans Summits here at Intuit. So thank you all for putting this amazing event together. I know that it was mentioned that most of this is volunteer work. You are amazing. And again, it's like I try to acknowledge my ignorance. I don't know it all. There's always more than I can learn. I really liked what they mentioned at an earlier session. I think it was the one moderated by Meredith, but about like how do you transition from being like an ally into an advocate. And it was mentioned a lot about like, like get involved in local politics, right? So that's something that I took from that session. I'm like, I need to get more involved. I mean, this is not just a trans issue, this is like a human issue, right? And at dinner last night, I was talking to someone, and they were talking about how there's this law that in Florida that now, even if you're not a resident and you're a trans person with a kid, they can take away your kid because there's they can say that it's child abuse. And that, it's on me not knowing that this is a thing. Like, how can we be more educated and know about all these issues that are happening around us? I say, like, coming from Latin America to the US, like, it opened my mind, but it's like, even in the US, these things are happening where we're supposed to be more open and advanced, culturally. So that just like showing up, listening to understand and empathize, I think would be.
And I do apologize because I know we're at time, but Abigail, would you like to say something as well?
Yeah, mine's gonna be short and sweet. Shout out to my uncle. You are my person, my chosen family that's all out there. Thank you for seeing me, for validating me, and for loving me as I am. And I think my biggest thing for safety is, you touched on it, listening to understand versus listening to respond. And hand in hand with that is being able to extend a lot of grace, not only to yourselves as you're learning and learning how to be a better ally or advocate, but also just being able to extend that grace to other people when we make mistakes. So we're all learning together, and we're all we have. So
Thanks. And a shout out from me to your uncle as well. So honestly, and to close, if we can take a moment to reflect, do you, I know we don't have time to say, do we have people in our lives specifically where we can be 100% free in ourselves, but really think about it for yourselves, is do you have that person? And then are you someone that your peers, your family, and your children can feel free to be 100% themselves? And thank you.